In the next 10 minutes, I'll break a habit of my lecturing life and attempt to keep to time. I was trying to outline what we understand by Corbynomics. The title here is taken from a short document that Corbyn issued on becoming leader, outlining his vision for 2020, which is clearly the date at which he hopes to be able to take power. And some efforts have been made by Corbyn and others in his team, particularly John McDonnell, to flesh out what they mean in terms of both a vision for what has gone wrong for the UK economy and, as importantly, what can be done through Corbynomics to address those problems. And clearly what Jeremy Corbyn's election has done, to some extent, is to reframe the terms of economic debate in the UK, because even after the financial crisis of 2008, I think it's fair to say that many of the underlying assumptions of economic policy have remained in the public debate. Now, just for once, I don't think the economics profession does too badly out of that, and there's been many what you might call mainstream economists who push broadly Keynesian solutions. But the overwhelming focus on the budget deficit as being virtually the be-all and end-all of economic policy, and not raising the wider issues over the sustainability of the economy, people's incomes and so on. I think Jeremy Corbyn's election throws over much more widely the terms of the debate over the economy. And Corbyn has argued, and it's actually echoed these days by a lot of mainstream economists in the UK and elsewhere, that austerity has held back growth in the UK. But not only that, the nature of the recovery we have seen has been unbalanced and unequal. It's been massively unequal in terms of the gains of who's gained and who's lost from this recovery. It's also been regionally, as we hardly need to point out, in the north of England, very strongly biased. It's been over-reliant yet again on debt-fueled private consumption. The own government and Office of Budget Responsibility forecasts point to expectations of rising debt levels to personal incomes. There's still been weak investment, there's still low human capital skills in the economy, and we still have a huge external deficit. In his speech to the conference, Jeremy Corbyn actually highlighted this. Now, I've been banging on about this to essentially deafening silence amongst others. I think the huge current account deficit the UK has with the rest of the world is actually much more important than the budget deficit. The fact we're running a huge deficit, more or less unprecedented in peacetime, even when the economy is growing quite sluggishly, is, I think, quite worrying. And I suggested this growth has been very skewed towards the richest areas and the richest groups in society. And what we need for recovery, Corbyn has argued, is much higher productivity, and that's the basis. It may not be sufficient to raise wages, but it's necessary to raise wages. But it's also crucial for closing the deficit. One reason the deficit has not come down in line with plans, as I'll show some figures in a moment, is that although the headline employment figures have grown so much as that's been part-time employment, self-employment, you get tax through decently paid people in full-time employment. They're on PAYE. They earn enough to pay taxes. They can't get away from paying taxes. People are self-employed, part-time, zero-hours contracts. They're basically not earning enough to pay much by way of taxes. And so there's a vision for a prosperity of a new partnership between government, workers and businesses. One of this is an impressive team of advisors, and Mariana Mazzucato, one of those, has been one of the most foremost economists in Britain in pointing out quite how involved the state always is in innovation. We shouldn't see states and markets as being in opposition in a naive way. The state plays a key role in underpinning innovation in successful economies. So the figure's quite stark. Even before the crisis, Britain was doing very, very badly on investments. This is just a percentage of national income invested. You see Britain bumping along the bottom of the world's leading economies, or definitions anyway, and getting worse with the crisis. And what underlying this is a way in which British companies have been investing less and less. They've been investing a smaller and smaller proportion of their profits. They've been moving from traditionally what they used to in the past, which is certainly most of the time be borrowers, most of the time borrowing to finance investment, to being net savers. On some estimates, their combined cash surplus is getting on for the equivalent of 50% of GDP. For technical reasons, that's probably a bit of an overstatement. But essentially, firms are saving rather than borrowing to invest. Despite low interest, relatively buoyant profits and everything else, then they're not investing. And that needs to change to underpin any sustainable recovery. As I was just saying, this is what's happened to employment. You see that the dark green line at the bottom, we have failed to return since the start of the crisis to the levels of full-time employment that we saw going into the crisis. The employment growth has been driven by part-time employees, including obviously zero-hours contracts employees, part-time or full-time self-employed, not decently paid full-time jobs. There's lots of evidence to discourage workers that many of the part-time, the self-employed workers would like to work longer hours and to have better jobs, but they're simply not available there. The recovery is not being generating that. And this is clearly a major failure. So the key policy proposals that Corbyn and his team have set out here is first of all obviously to end austerity, that if you're in a downturn, and as we now have successively over this year, we've seen inflation running below the target range for the Bank of England. It's failing to hit its mandated target range, but by being too low. It does suggest the economy is running well below its feasible capacity. It's not hitting constraint. There's still a problem, a lack of demand in the economy. If that's the case, after some early questions, they rejected Osborne's fiscal shelter. This is exactly the time of an economy with very weak recovery and very low interest rates, historically unprecedented low interest rates. It's exactly the time when you invest in infrastructure and skills, as it should have said on there, and housing. Particular emphasis on skills in adult and further education, as well as higher education. And as part of this, we proposed to set up a national investment bank. This is part of a wider strategy to upgrade the industrial structure of the UK, to move to a more thoroughgoing industrial base of the UK that's been eroded over recent decades, to move away from being essentially a screwdriver economy in sections where you're just doing bits of the value chain, to have more integrated industry within the UK, and particular emphasis on areas like green industries that we were doing relatively well at and have lost advantage through lack of government support and neglect over the years. Now, as well as that, how do you pay for this? And this is where, in a sense, I'm going to have a slight longer version of this, which I was fiddling around with this morning. Will go up on SPERI's blog site, flesh out some of the details. Much of the claims, in many ways, what's wrong with the economy, are quite widely held across the IMF, and even I found Standard & Poor's rating agencies who say this is exactly the time to spend on infrastructure if you're an advanced economy, because interest rates are so low, economies are so sluggish. This is sluggish, is exactly what you should spend. The controversy has really been about how to pay for this, the means, not so much the ends as the means. And the two areas emphasised have been a shift in the nature of taxation and spending, and what's become to term people's QE. There's some discussion of nationalisation, but beyond state ownership of the railways, they wrote back slightly on nationalisation. To take people's QE easily, although McDonnell Latley seems to be slightly directing this, at the moment, what it's saying is essentially the Bank of England has been involved in quantitative easing. It has moved from holding hardly any British government debt to owning about 30% of the British government debt outstanding. Instead of buying that up, which has been a questionable effectiveness and only helps a relatively small proportion of the population, the National Investment Bank could establish itself, issue bonds, and these essentially could be bought by the Bank of England to finance it. So essentially it could be financed by monetary creation. This has been widely criticised. The criticisms, I think, would hold a bit more water if people hadn't already gone along with the QE that's already happened. A perhaps slightly more reasonable criticism would be to argue, in the context of very low interest rates, it's not really necessary. You could probably issue bonds to finance a national investment bank at very low interest rates quite easily anyway. The other key area has been on tax and spending. There's been a combination of the tax expert Richard Murphy's indications that there's a lot more money the HMRC could collect. It's been underfunded, it's undersupported in terms of staff, which obviously the government and Corbyn government will seek to remedy. So a combination of this, that in various areas, perhaps talk about later in the discussion, there is potential for the HMRC to collect substantially more revenues than they do at the moment. And his estimates come out of potentially lost revenues is about 3 times what HMRC suggests. And secondly, the question around corporate welfare, which Kevin Farnsworth, an associate fellow of SPERI, published a paper on, which was picked up, widely criticised in various circles, although, as he pointed out in his article reiterating it, almost nobody did them the courtesy of checking with him before they advanced their criticisms. But there's around, he estimates, £90 billion of support for companies provided through various support schemes and tax breaks. He's not saying that it would be feasible, even desirable, to get through all of this, but we need to have a debate about what we should be spending. I would sum up by saying my question marks really over this. It's been criticised over the fiscal charter and whether this is going to undermine Bank of England independence. John McDonnell denies this, as effectively all you're doing is to change the terms of reference the Bank of England has and then leave you to get on with its job and how much you could really take. In a nutshell, I think the problem is an old one. Governments of the left, democratic governments of the left, face a capital dilemma, if you like. They want to intervene in markets to change outcomes, to redistribute income, to create welfare states and so on. But at the end of the day, they need private investment, or ultimately they need this notion of socialisation and the investment of the government to step in and to do it instead. Investment is so flat even at the moment with favourable conditions, unless you think any austerity is going to be sufficient to create the demand that will bring forth the investment. We will need to think seriously about what measures can get investment, either public or private, to sustain recovery in the economy. As I said, we can talk about the details more in discussion.